There are cities in the Imperium that never see the sun, cities older than memory, layered in strata of ash and steel, so vast that a man can live and die without ever knowing the sky is real. They rise like mountains forged by human hands, built upon the bones of their own forgotten foundations. Hive cities, they are called. Pillars of production, engines of unending labor, monuments to the Imperium's hunger. And when one of them falls, it does not fall quietly. It begins in silence. A flicker in the lumen strips, a shipment that does not arrive, a water ration that is cut by a single tenth, a rumor whispered in the exhaust-choked corridors that the administratum clerk who once stamped ration permits has not been seen in days. No alarms, no thunder, just the quiet groan of a machine older than history, grinding to a halt. But beneath that silence, rot spreads. The workers in the sump-level habs begin to disappear. Gangs move with more boldness. The enforcers tighten their grips, but their eyes flicker with a fear they cannot show. The nobles in their spire dine upon imported delicacies and tell themselves that everything is under control. It is always the same lie. It is the lie every hive tells itself, until the day the lie tears open, until the day smoke rises in the mid-habs and bodies fall from transit rails to the depths below, until the day the vox-net screams with the sound of a billion voices calling for mercy. But mercy does not live here. When a hive city collapses, it is not a battle. It is an unraveling, a slow, exquisite disintegration of order itself. Not even the Adeptus Arbites can hold back a world whose heart has already stopped beating, and in the end there is only one question: who survives the fall, if anyone can? They used to say the hive was alive, not in any poetic or sentimental way, but in the very real sense that it breathed. You could hear it always, even in the dead hours between shifts when the manufactorum furnaces dimmed and the transit rails slowed to a crawl. A low, ceaseless exhalation of fans the size of cathedrals pushing recycled air through vents older than the Imperium itself. A heartbeat of pistons and pressure valves echoing through metal bones. If you placed your ear against the right bulkhead, you could feel it pulse. A whole world of steel and stone and smog inhaling and exhaling beneath its own weight. That was before the breathing changed. I lived in Hab C9 Lower, where the walls were the color of dried blood, and the rebreather masks never left our faces, not even while we slept. The air had always tasted of metal and old engine oil, but it was air we could live on. Air that had been breathed by generations who came before us. The hive was our sky, our horizon, our everything. We did not dream of stars. We only dreamed of being allowed to keep breathing. My shift used to begin with the klaxon ringing through the ward, but the klaxon had been sputtering lately. Some days it shrieked. Some days it only hissed like a dying pipe. Some days it did not sound at all, and we woke by habit instead of command. That was the first sign, though none of us named it back then. Machines do not fail in a hive unless something deeper has begun to rot. We lined up outside Manufactorum Primus, in rows so tight our elbows dug into the ribs of the workers beside us, a million bodies pressed together between ferrocrete towers that stretched high enough to blot out the memory of open sky. The morning was always dim. Morning did not mean dawn here. Morning meant lumen strips flickering to full brightness for the day's ration cycle. But lately, the light had been struggling, pulsing, as though something was choking the hive's great lungs. I remember the moment we first smelled it. Not smoke, not chemical discharge, something older, something like dead water and mold-slick stone. It drifted through the vents in a single breath. Every worker paused, every respirator clicked and rasped. Eyes met, words did not. Something beneath us had changed. No alarms sounded, no overseer barked orders, no Arbites thundered down from their fortified barracks to demand compliance or executions. The silence was worse. Silence in a hive means the systems are thinking, evaluating, rebalancing, or failing. I remember a man beside me, old, his face a map of scars and welding burns, lifting his mask to sniff the air directly. Some of us gasped, expecting him to choke, expecting him to collapse. But he didn't. He just breathed, deeply, slowly, and then his shoulders sagged. We asked him what it was. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. We all understood it, though we had no words for it then. It was the scent of something ending. The overseers tried to push us into the manufactorum that day, and for the first time in years, the crowd pushed back. Not in a riot, not in rage, just in hesitation. A small thing, a moment where the rhythm broke. A system as vast as a hive cannot afford hesitation. It is built on the assumption that people move as commanded, that bodies enter the furnace of labor without question. When the rhythm falters, the hive falters. We entered eventually, we always did. The alternative was execution by starvation, or worse, relocation to reclamation pits, where even names were erased. But that hesitation lingered. It was the first crack, and cracks never stay small. Days passed, the air grew heavier, the lines for water stretched longer, the rations grew thinner. No announcements came, no explanations, just the slow tightening of everything, the hive drawing in breath and forgetting how to exhale. People began disappearing. Workers who had held their posts for decades simply did not arrive. Their bunks were stripped, their names removed from work assignments. No one asked where they went. Asking was dangerous. Knowing was worse. But we all knew in a quiet, shared way that needed no words. The hive was consuming its own. Some said it was disease in the sump, or a power failure deep below, or a sabotage attempt by rival guilds. But those explanations were too clean, too rational. When a hive starts to die, it does not do so neatly. It frays, it unravels, and we could all feel the unraveling begin. We just did not yet understand how deep it would go, or how many of us it would take with it. The hive still breathed. But now, every breath sounded like a warning. Continue? If you can hear this voice within the roar of the hive's dying breath, then stay with us. There are stories that are warnings, and stories that are remembrance, and this will be both. To those who walk beside us in the archives of this galaxy, lend your strength. Share this chronicle, subscribe to the record, let the Vox channel carry these echoes further. The Imperium forgets easily, but we do not have to. The first true sign was the heat. Manufactorum Primus was always hot, of course. The great forge lines belched promethium-fed flame into foundry vents that had been running since before my ancestors were born. Heat was the constant of our lives. But one day, it shifted. It became something else. A heavy, suffocating pressure, as though the very walls were exhaling furnace breath into our lungs. The coolant pumps that kept the forges balanced rattled with uncertain rhythm, and every worker felt it without needing to speak. When the heat rises in a hive, it is never arbitrary. Something in the system is failing. We worked the conveyor lines as we always had, stamping plates of steel, inserting rivets, welding armor plates for vehicles we would never see. The overseers paced the gantries above us, their shock mauls crackling, their expressions growing tighter day by day. They sensed it too. The hive was changing. I remember the moment a vent pipe cracked above the central forge. It was a sound like old bone snapping. A fine mist of scalding steam hissed out, then erupted into a white plume that screamed as it poured across the work floor. Men and women nearest to it didn't even have time to run. Their skin sloughed beneath the heat, peeling away in sheets as they fell, their screams drowned out by the roaring hiss of ruptured pressure. We froze. Instinct said to move, training said to stay, survival said to be lower than the next person. The alarm should have sounded, the emergency seal should have dropped, the automata servitors should have rolled forward with suppression foam. None of them came. We watched death unfold, not as an accident, but as an unveiling. Something essential had stopped working. It was the oldest worker among us, Bell we called him, who made the first sound. Not a cry, not a prayer, just a quiet, broken laugh that echoed across the steel floors. He had seen hives fail before, he said, seen worlds fall from within. He spoke of it softly, like one recalls a weather pattern, or a superstition one wishes were untrue. Hives do not die because of rebellion, he murmured. They do not die because of war or famine or plague. Those are simply the last symptoms. A hive dies when it forgets its purpose, when the machine stops remembering that it must sustain its people, when its great heart no longer knows how to beat. We wanted him to be wrong. We needed him to be wrong, because if he was right, then everything we relied upon, every ration, every lumen, every drop of processed water that kept us alive, was already slipping away. We returned to our hab blocks in silence that night. No voices rose in the corridors, no music from the lower markets. Even the gangs that lingered near the transit shafts seemed to withdraw into the dark, sensing something larger than their petty rivalries now stirring. The rebreather filters clogged faster. The air tasted stale, then sour, then metallic again. Children coughed into their blankets. The elderly no longer left their cots. The medical stations, already understaffed, began turning people away. I remember lifting my mask while alone, just once, just to confirm what I already feared. The air had changed its weight. It laid heavy on the tongue, the taste of decay. I lowered the mask immediately, though I knew the filters no longer made much difference. We still went to work the next day. Of course we did. Work was survival. Work was the only anchor left. Without it, there were no rations, no place to sleep, no claim to existence at all. But something had shifted in the way we walked, in the way we looked at one another. For the first time, we were not simply enduring the hive. We were waiting for something. That evening, when I returned to Hab C9, the lights did something they had never done in my lifetime. They flickered, not the brief pulse of power cycling, but a long, stuttering fade that threw the corridor into a darkness so deep it felt physical. 1,000 breathers rasped in unison. Even the children went quiet. Then the lights came back, but dimmer, weaker. Not bright enough to chase away the shadows. The hive had always been dim, but now it felt nighted, as though the darkness was no longer absence, but presence, something alive, something patient, and it was watching us. The hive still breathed, but now each breath sounded like the beginning of a whisper we were not meant to hear. The first night the lights dimmed, no one slept. We lay in our rows of stacked bunks, each compartment barely large enough to crawl into, the metal frames groaning beneath stacked weight. The air recyclers ticked in slow, uneven rhythms, and every few minutes a pressure valve somewhere in the hab would gasp like a dying animal. I could hear the breathing of the others, hundreds of lungs working beneath cloth and filter mesh. The hive had always sounded alive, but now it sounded sick. From the ventilation grates above came a steady, hollow moan of wind being drawn through passageways too wide and too old to map. I had grown up with that sound, yet that night it had a different character. Not merely movement, but hunger. No one spoke. Words would have made it real. At some hour, there were no clocks here, only cycle sirens that now no longer cried. A distant boom shuddered through the floor. The metal walls trembled. A few bunks rattled loose bolts. Some children whimpered, and their guardians hushed them, though their own hands shook. We all knew the sound of a detonation within the hive's lower levels, but this was deeper, larger, a sound like something tearing itself apart far below the habs, and still, no alarms, no Arbites deployment, nothing from the Administratum Vox loudhailers except static. Order had not been lost yet, but it had begun to retreat. The next shift cycle came late. The lumen strips rose to a pale, sickly glow that felt less like illumination and more like an afterthought. We lined up. We marched. We entered the manufactorum, but something essential had broken in the shape of that march. No overseer barked reminders. No servo cherub drifted overhead to scan attendance. The machine spirit of the place itself seemed absent, as though its rituals had gone unanswered. Bell was not there that morning, neither were dozens of others. Their bunks had been cleared, their names scratched off data slates. No explanations, no notices, just absence, sterilized and administrative, the way the Imperium prefers to handle death. A new overseer took the gantry, a man with eyes like polished augmetic lenses, and a voice modulated flat through his vox grill. He did not speak the usual litany. He did not invoke the Emperor's blessing upon the day's work cycle. He simply stared down at us, and in that silence, we knew even the ritual faith of labor had been abandoned. In the Imperium, when ritual is abandoned, something catastrophic has already begun. We worked under that void of meaning. Sparks flew from welding torches, pistons slammed, conveyors clattered, but there was no hum of unity, no steady hive rhythm. Every action felt isolated, every sound sharp. The machine was no longer a single organism. It was a corpse twitching through old motions. Midway through the shift, the power dipped again. Not enough to shut the lines, but enough to make every lumen stutter. The shadows thickened across the manufactorum floor. In that flickering half-light, I saw movement along the high catwalks, figures passing quickly, too quickly, like they were gliding rather than walking. They did not wear overseer coats. They did not wear worker fatigues. They moved like something that did not need to be seen. When the lights steadied, they were gone. Days passed, more people vanished. The ration queues doubled in length. Those unable to stand long enough simply collapsed. The Metagi outposts no longer opened their doors. The gangs that prowled the lower transit shafts no longer shouted challenges to one another. They moved silently now, as if afraid something greater than them listened. Rumors began to spread, not shouted or whispered, but breathed. Rumors of sump tunnels flooding with bodies. Rumors of the Arbites sealing entire hab blocks under quarantine with no explanation. Rumors that deep in the sub-hive, the corpse recycling plants had stopped functioning, and the bodies were piling high enough to block access ramps. The hive still breathed, but the breath had become wet, thick, clotted. On the 10th cycle of failing lights, the klaxon finally sounded, not to call us to work, but to warn. Its cry was jagged and uneven, its tone wrong, as though the machine spirit that controlled it was being forced to scream. We gathered in the corridors, eyes wide, masks trembling, and then through the vox speakers came a single phrase. Maintain position. Do not descend. No explanation. No further instruction. Just those words. Maintain position. Do not descend. But the hive had 1,000 levels. What counted as down? We all looked at the floor. We all knew the hive was dying from below, and whatever had begun there was coming upward. The breathing of the city deepened as though the steel lungs beneath our feet were drawing in a final vast swallow of air before something broke inside them. We looked at one another for the first time, truly afraid. We learned what the warning meant the next cycle. There was no muster order, no shift siren, no overseers waiting along the transit rails. The manufactorum gates remained sealed, their massive bulkhead teeth locked in place with a finality that made the air feel smaller. The vox-net sputtered static mixed with distant overlapping voices like prayers being said underwater. Something had broken, something structural, something essential. The hive's endless rhythm of work and rest, labor and exhaustion had paused, and hives do not pause. Not for storms, not for riots, not for death, only for collapse. The corridors outside the hab blocks filled with bodies, workers, children, old men with eyes already gone to glass. No one shouted, no one tried to force answers. We all knew those answers were below our feet, the sump habs, the waste districts, the places where the hive buried what it didn't want to remember. For a time, we simply stood. The flickering lumen strips buzzed overhead, each faltering pulse sending shadows crawling up the walls like something living. The air recyclers groaned, laboring harder than ever. They were trying to keep the hive breathing, trying to keep us from suffocating, trying and failing. A sound rose from deep below, carried through the ventilation shafts. A rumble, wet and heavy, like a swarm of something dragging itself across metal. It was not engines, it was not machinery, it was organic, and it was moving. Someone in the crowd whispered that the lower habs had been sealed. Someone else said the Arbites were already dead. Someone else spoke of a cult, a hidden congregation that had been gathering in the dark for decades, waiting for this moment. The Hive was a place of whispers now. I remember a child tugging at their mother's sleeve, asking if the sky would come back. The mother did not answer. She did not know how. None of us had seen the sky, but now we feared the darkness above just as much as the darkness below. Then the lights failed completely. Not flickered, not dimmed, failed. The corridor plunged into a darkness so total it erased depth and distance. A darkness so thick it felt like pressure against the skin. The only sound was breathing, the breathing of thousands of people, panicked and uneven, and beneath that, the deeper breathing of the Hive itself. The mechanical lungs still worked. They were the only thing that did. People began to move, not by reason but by instinct. They reached blindly for familiar walls, for the touch of another person's shoulder. The crowd compressed, bodies pressing. Together, the panic beginning to rise like heat from a furnace. Someone screamed. The scream was swallowed instantly, lost beneath the rising tide of voices. Fear had memory here, and this fear remembered starvation, riot, purge, execution. It remembered how fast a hive could turn into a feeding pit. The lights returned in sputtering pulses, one lumen strip at a time. Not steady, not safe, just enough to reveal shapes moving where no shapes should have been. Along the floor, along the walls, along the ceiling. Not beasts, not xenos, not demons. People, human bodies, still dressed in work fatigues, crawling on hands and knees like animals. Their eyes were wide and empty. Their breath came in desperate, hungry gasps. Their mouths moved without forming words. They were alive, but something in them had been hollowed out. The crowd recoiled, pressing backward, crushing inward against itself. But there was nowhere to go. The corridor was a throat, and we were already deep inside it. One of the crawling figures lifted its face toward us, not pleading, not begging, simply observing, as though we were something it did not recognize anymore. The air smell changed then. Sour, rotting. Not death, transformation. Someone tried to run, someone else fell. Panic surged, voices rose into a single ragged cry, and then the Hive spoke. Not through Vox speakers, not through alarms, through the walls themselves. A deep, slow, shuddering groan of metal, like the city was trying to breathe through lungs full of ash. The crawling figures froze at the sound, so did we. The Hive was collapsing, but not all at once. It was collapsing like something long dormant had awakened, something deep, something patient, something hungry. We did not yet understand what had begun beneath us, but we would, soon. The day after the darkness came, the Hive awoke to fire. It was not a sudden blaze, not an eruption of flame tearing through corridors like a living thing. No, it began as a scent, the faint acrid tang of promethium smoke drifting through ventilation ducts and open bulkheads like incense burned in mourning. The kind of smoke that tells you a fire is burning somewhere far from where you stand, but moving slowly, steadily, toward you. The manufactorum gates remained sealed. The overseers were nowhere to be seen. The vox-net did not speak. And so, for the first time in generations, the hab blocks did not empty into the labor lines. People remained in the corridors, in their bunks, in the communal squares where cracked murals of the imperial Aquila stared down with peeling, forgetful wings. The normal rhythms were gone. The world was holding its breath. But fire does not wait. We saw it first as a distant glow, far down a transit corridor where the vent grates had begun to rattle. The flame was not bright, it was dim, guttering, oxygen-starved, but it was fire all the same, and fire in a hive is death. Our ancestors built upward to escape the ash seas below, but they brought the flames with them. One spark in a hab block could consume tens of thousands before suppression systems even registered it. Except now, the suppression systems did not respond. Someone shouted for water crews, someone else cried for the Arbites, but the Arbites' fortress precinct was silent. The great bastion doors remained closed, the execution balconies empty. Whether they were dead or simply refusing to answer was a question none of us dared approach. The gangs came instead. They emerged from the transit shafts like shadows given flesh, marked in sigils carved into armor plate clothing, faces covered in patchwork respirator masks, eyes gleaming with the sharp, restless hunger of those who had always survived by taking from others. In the old cycles, they had been a nuisance, a threat to the weak, a force that the enforcers controlled with shock batons and ration punishment. But now, with no law above and fire below, they became something else. Not opportunists, claimants, predators smelling a new ecosystem being born. They did not come for us, not at first. They came for the fire. They came armed with crude pump hoses attached to rusted promethium tanks, wielding them like spears and shields, not to extinguish, to harness. The crawlers, those hollow-eyed workers who had moved like beasts, had vanished during the night. Perhaps they fled deeper, perhaps they burned, perhaps they watched from the dark. None of us wished to learn. It was the gangs that mattered now because we could see in them something we recognized. Purpose. Even if it was violence. Their leader stepped forward, a tall figure wrapped in scavenged flak plating, a vox grill mass fused to scar tissue across half his jaw. He had the bearing of someone who had never bowed, not to overseers, not to ration clerks, not to Arbit's shock troopers. His voice, when it came, crackled like burning cables. "The Hive's dying," he said, not a threat, not a rally, a statement. "Those who stay in place will feed it, those who move may live." No one asked where to move. There was nowhere to go, but standing still felt like waiting to drown. I felt my ribs tighten. The air had grown hotter again, not the forge heat of Manufactorum Primus. This was the heat of pressure building, of systems overloading. Somewhere, vents were failing. Somewhere, ducts were backing up. Somewhere, something was forcing hot air upward faster than the hive could swallow it. Bell had once said a hive breathes. Now, the hive was choking. The gangs began to march, not in formation, just forward, toward the fire's glow, toward the lower levels we had been told not to approach, and people followed, some out of desperation, some out of curiosity, some simply because standing still had become unbearable. I went with them, not because I believed in survival, but because I needed to understand what the hive was becoming. We moved through corridors where the lumen strips flickered in twitching pulses, bathing us in alternating shadow and half-light. The metal walls sweated condensation. The floors vibrated with unseen machinery laboring beyond safe limits. Then, as we turned a downward ramp, we saw the source of the fire. A ventilation shaft, wide as a cathedral nave, vomited smoke like a furnace. The great fans within it were still turning, but slowly, unevenly, as though clogged. The fire burning below was no ordinary blaze. It was controlled, contained, channeled. Someone had set it, not randomly, purposefully, ritualistically, and the gangs were not attacking it. They knelt before it. The flames cast long shadows across their bodies, flickering in patterns that seemed almost intentional, like symbols being traced upon the walls by unseen hands. The hive was not simply decaying, it was being rewritten. By whom or what, we did not yet know, but we were already in its grasp. The heat radiating from the shaft coated the skin like a second layer. Even through my rebreather, I could taste burning metal, scorched oil, and something else, something organic, the kind of scent that lingers in places where bodies have burned. The gangs remained kneeling, motionless except for the faint tremor of their masks, inhaling and exhaling. The flames flickered in a strangely rhythmic pattern, as though stirred by breath rather than by draft. I had seen devotional rites before. The ecclesiarchy held them in the midhabs sometimes when they wanted to remind us of the emperor's grace, though the preachers never stayed long. But this was no imperial rite. There were no hymns, no liturgy, only silence, an oppressive, reverent silence, as if something in the flames demanded stillness. The leader of the gang, the one with the fused vox mask, rose slowly. He did not turn to us. He faced the fire as though it were an altar. "We are not the first," he said, voice distorted by static. "We are only the latest. The hive remembers. The hive always remembers." Bell had spoken of memory too, of the hive forgetting how to live. But this was different. This was not memory dying. This was memory waking. One of the workers beside me whispered a prayer to the Emperor. The words cracked and shaky. The gang leader's head twitched, not in mockery, but like he heard something else in the prayer, something only he understood. His shoulders stiffened. His breath grew sharper, more urgent. He tilted his head, listening to the flames as though expecting an answer. Then the shaft roared. A surge of fire exploded upward, a column of heat that blasted across the chamber and sent us all staggering back. The kneeling gang members did not rise. They did not scream. They simply pressed their foreheads to the floor, their hands outstretched toward the flame. I saw their skin blister and peel where it was exposed, but none of them moved. None of them made a sound. They were offering themselves, not dying. Offering. The flames receded, the air trembled, and then the whisper came. Not through air, through metal, through the floor beneath our feet. A vibration, not sound. A pulse. A heartbeat. The hive was breathing again. But now, that breath felt alive with something new. Something that had been growing in the dark for years, maybe decades. The gang leader finally turned to face us. His eyes were visible now behind the fractured visor of his mask, wide, fever-bright, and unafraid. "The lower levels are gone," he said. "Flooded, burned, starved, whatever you choose to name it. The hive is shedding what it no longer needs." A worker beside me shook his head, stepping backward. "That's madness," he whispered. "The hive sustains us. It must. It must." The gang leader nodded once, slowly. "Yes, it must, but not all of us." He pointed downward, toward the vent shaft and the fire below it. "That is where the old goes to die. What rises will be new, and only those who embrace the change will live." The crowd murmured. Some backed away, shaking, refusing to hear. Some leaned forward as though the fire had placed hands beneath their chins and lifted their faces toward its glow. This was the first time we realized something fundamental. Not everyone wanted to survive the same way. Some wanted the Hive restored, some wanted the Hive reborn, and some wanted to watch it burn. The gang leader began descending the maintenance rungs of the ventilation shaft. Flamelight cast his shadow long across the wall, a silhouette of jagged metal and scar tissue, stretched and distorted like a prophet or a monster. Others followed him without hesitation. Workers, mothers, children old enough to stand. They climbed down into the firelit dark, swallowed by heat and smoke, vanishing wordlessly into whatever waited below. I did not follow, but I did not step back either. I stood between the pull of the flame and the collapsing world above, rooted in a moment where choice had become a ghost. Around me, the Hive groaned again. The temperature rose. The air thinned. The walls trembled with strain. Somewhere high above, in the spire levels where the nobles dined beneath chandeliers of crystal and gold, they likely still believed the Hive was stable. But down here, the truth was already written. The Hive was no longer failing, it was transforming. And we were trapped inside the chrysalis with it. We did not move for a long time after they descended. The fire's glow pulsed gently, like the afterbeat of a convulsion, reflecting off rusted metal and soot-streaked faces. The corridor behind us had emptied. Those who had followed this far now stood suspended between terror and revelation, uncertain whether they had just witnessed an emergence or the first stage of a devouring. The heat from the shaft was unbearable now. Sweat collected beneath my mask, turning every breath into damp fabric and recycled warmth. The air had become a burden. A tremor shook the walkway beneath our feet, deep, resonant, coming from below. A distant grinding followed, like stone dragged across a metal plate. The Hive shifted. Every great structure in the Imperium settles over centuries, but this was no settling. This was movement with intent, a system clearing pathways, a gut contracting. The Hive was digesting. A voice near me broke. A man, not young, not old, began muttering to himself, tugging at the seals of his rebreather. His breath grew fast and shallow, panic clawing at the edge of his mind. Others reached to restrain him, but he slipped between their hands, tearing off the mask entirely. Air rushed over his face, hot, heavy with chemical particulates. He gasped, and the moment that air touched his lungs, something raw and hollow flickered in his eyes. He was breathing like the crawlers, shallow, rapid, animal. His pupils widened, his posture hunched, his fingers curled inward like claws. We backed away. He stumbled once, twice, then dropped to all fours with a sound that did not belong in a human throat. We did not touch him. We did not speak. We watched him crawl, slowly, painfully, toward the shaft where the others had descended, drawn toward the same unseen gravity that pulled everything else downward. No one tried to stop him. No one could. It was not a choice anymore. It was contagion, not disease in the biological sense. The medici would have known how to name that. This was deeper, psychological, social, ritual, an idea that had replaced breath. The Hive was teaching us how it wanted to be inhabited. We began to retreat, quietly, step by step, afraid to make sound, afraid to draw notice from things we could no longer understand. The corridor behind us felt cooler, but not safe. The lights flickered as though they were struggling beneath the weight of the Hive's shifting energy demands. Systems were being rerouted, whole districts being abandoned, control relinquished. What rose in their place was not chaos, it was purpose without reason. We returned to Hab C9 to find it changed. Doors sealed, ladders locked, vent grates welded. Someone, or something, had moved through while we were gone. Where temporary locks had once made territorial boundaries, now there were barriers meant to keep things out, or keep things in. Voices echoed in the corridors, prayer-like, not imperial hymns. Something older, whispered rhythmically in the dark. The speaker was unseen, yet the words traveled like smoke, clinging to the skin, impossible to ignore. Breathe and become. Breathe and remember. Breathe and return. No one admitted to speaking it, no one admitted to understanding it, but some lips moved with it anyway. Night, if we could call it that, came without lights. The lumen strips flickered twice, failed, and did not return. We lay in our bunks in darkness that pressed so tightly it collapsed thought. Only breath remained, the staggered chorus of 1,000 lungs gasping through failing filters. And beneath that breath, the Hive exhaled, a long, rolling sigh like steam released after pressure has built for centuries. I dreamed of corridors spiraling downward, of steel cathedrals beneath the earth, of a core glowing like a furnace heart, and at the center, not a creature, not a god, but a wound, a place where something had once been, where something was returning. I woke with my mask soaked in sweat and a taste of ash on my tongue. The vents were glowing, not with fire, with light, faint, pulsing, vein-like. The Hive was illuminating itself from within, not dying, changing. The air trembled. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside. Slow, synchronized, many of them, not gang, not Arbites, not workers. Something else, something that had come up from below, and it was looking for us. The footsteps were steady. Too steady, no shuffle, no hesitation, the kind of synchronized tread that only came from drill or indoctrination, or something deeper than either. They echoed through the dark corridor outside Hab C9, measured and precise, as if each heel struck the metal floor on a predetermined beat. We lay frozen in our bunks, every breath a betrayal of our position. No one reached for weapons. Weapons were useless against something that walked like that. The first shadow passed across the doorway, long, angular, wrong. Human proportions, but elongated somehow, as though stretched or rearranged by pressures we could not see. The figure stepped into the faint glow of emergency lumen filaments, struggling to hold a pulse. Its movements were smooth, fluid, unmarred by fatigue. The body was that of a worker, still wearing the tattered uniform of Manufactorum Primus, but something had been done to it. The spine arched with unnatural grace, the fingers were too long, the head tilted at a slight angle as though listening to a sound we could not hear. Its face was covered in a mask, not a rebreather, not a respirator, a mask of welded scrap metal, molded into the rough outline of a human visage, featureless except for two vertical slits where eyes should have been. Through those slits came a faint glow, not lumen light, a bioluminescent radiance, a glow from within. Behind it came others, dozens, maybe more. Their masks were all slightly different, shapes hammered at random, designs scrawled in soot and blood, edges jagged like broken icons. Some had chains wrapped around their torsos, others bore ritual scars carved into exposed flesh. And yet they moved as one. Their footsteps fell with synchronous certainty, the sound like a single entity wearing many bodies. They did not enter, they only stood, watching, not waiting for us to act, waiting for us to understand. Someone in the bunk above mine began to shake, softly at first, then harder, the tremors rattling the frame. Fear does not break gradually, it breaks all at once. He tried to stifle it, pressing his mask into his sleeves to quiet the sound, but panic is a scent, it does not need noise. One of the masked figures turned its head, slowly, precisely, directly toward him. We held our breath. The figure moved. It did not walk. It glided, steps so smooth they made no sound. Its hands rose, palms open, not aggressive, not violent, offer-like. The man atop the bunk sobbed. "Please," he whispered. "Please, please." The figure pressed its metal mask to his forehead. There was a soft, wet sound, not a strike, not a tear, just dissolution. The man's body slackened, his limbs falling loose like his bones had suddenly remembered they were meant to be dust. He did not scream, he did not struggle, he simply yielded. His breath slowed, then quieted, then ceased, but he did not fall. The figure held him upright, cradled him gracefully, tenderly, and when it stepped back, the man stepped with it. He stood. He was alive, but his eyes were empty. No pain, no fear, no self. He joined the procession, they turned as one and began to move again down the corridor toward the lower shafts. The same direction the gang had gone, the same direction the fire had burned, the same direction the hive had begun to remember. As they disappeared into the dark, a silence settled so deep it seemed to erase sound itself. Someone whispered, voice cracking, "Emperor, preserve us." But the words felt wrong here, out of place, like speaking the wrong name in a cathedral built for another god. The vents pulsed again, light running through them like veins. The hive was not dying. No, it was being born, not into something new, but into something ancient, something that had always been here under the layers of industry and doctrine and labor and suppression, something we had built our lives on without ever knowing. A voice rose from below, not one voice, thousands, millions, chanting, breathing, becoming. The floor vibrated beneath our feet, the city was waking, and we were inside its stream. When the procession vanished into the lower corridors, silence flooded the hab block like a tide. No one spoke, no one moved. The hive's lumen strips flickered overhead in weak, inconsistent pulses, casting the world in a stuttering half-light that made everything look like it was breathing. The vents were still glowing, faint, pulsing, like veins carrying light instead of blood. Every surface felt warm now, as though the hive's temperature had risen by several degrees overnight. Heat like this was a warning. We all knew it. When a hive city heats, pressure builds. When pressure builds, systems fail. And when systems fail, a single spark can ignite the entire world. Above, in the spire levels, perhaps they had emergency reservoirs, water shields, cooling towers. Perhaps they believed themselves insulated. But we knew the truth. Heat always rises, and everything burns. I remember standing in the corridor outside the bunk rows, watching the darkness where the masked figures had disappeared, feeling a sensation I had never known before, the sense that the hive was no longer merely a place, but a presence. And it was listening. Someone finally spoke, a woman whose voice was coarse from years of breathing recycled dust. "We have to go up," she said, not loud, not commanding, just certain. "Down is lost." The words were simple, but they drew every gaze. Up, the spire, the noble tiers. Places we had never seen except as distant silhouettes etched in smog-filtered lumens. We had been taught our entire lives that the Hive was a ladder, and where one was born on that ladder was where they died. To move upward was forbidden, punishable, unthinkable, but now the structure that enforced those boundaries was collapsing. The Arbites precinct was silent, the overseers were gone, the manufactorium sealed, the gangs kneeling to fire, the lower levels changing. And the procession of masked figures had made something undeniably clear. There was no safety left below. We began to move, not as a crowd, not as a mob, as survivors, small clusters, tight groups. People who had worked beside one another for years without ever learning names now held each other's sleeves, shoulders, hands. The Hive was vast, a labyrinth of plated walkways, broken tram routes, hanging catwalks suspended over enormous vent shafts and furnace chutes that dropped into blackness. But every worker knew their local paths. We had spent our lives moving through them. The Hive was a prison, yes, but also a map carved into our bones. To go up meant entering territories controlled by gangs who had never needed to fear enforcers. It meant passing through old locks, sealed freight tunnels, the ruins of collapsed hubs, zones marked as condemned. But staying meant becoming something hollow. So we climbed. The ascent began through a maintenance stairwell wide enough for only one person at a time. Metal walls sweated condensation. The steps were slick and uneven, warped by heat. Expansion. Every 10th step had a rusted slot where a corpse recycling chute used to feed down into the lower furnaces. Now the only thing that came through them was faint smoke. We climbed in silence, breath rasping through clogged filters, limbs aching. Some carried children, some carried nothing, some carried tools, wrenches, metal pipes, cutting torches, things that could become weapons if needed. Above us, the Hive groaned. Metal shifted, settling under strain, bulkheads strained. Somewhere distant, alarms finally began to sound, but not in warning. These were mechanical screams, systems dying, machine spirits howling at their own unraveling. Then from below, a sound rose. Not footsteps, not chants. Something like metal claws scraping along the walls. Someone whispered, "They're climbing too." We did not look back. The stairwell emptied into a transit junction, vast and echoing, filled with unused rail lines suspended over a drop so deep it dissolved into darkness. The air smelled of ozone and burning insulation. The lumen globes overhead were shattered, leaving only the light from the vent vanes pulsing along the walls. And there, across the platform, we saw them. Not masked figures, not gangs. People, workers like us, hundreds of them, eyes sunken with hunger, faces hollow, some clutched makeshift weapons, broken rebar, lengths of chain, sharpened tools. Their expressions were desperate, not crazed. They had climbed too, and they had reached this junction first. The moment they saw us, they stiffened, not with recognition, with fear, because they thought we were the ones below. No one spoke. No one dared step forward. Then someone behind me whispered the only truth that mattered. This city has no sides anymore. But it was too late. Someone in the other group swung first. A pipe arced through the air. A scream followed, and just like that, the Hive's last illusion of unity shattered. The city of industry had become a city of knives. The first blow did not kill, it merely broke the space between us. A pipe striking a forearm, bone thudding against metal, a grunt of pain. But pain was not what mattered. What mattered was that the strike proved something terrible and undeniable. None of us knew who the enemy was anymore. The man who had been struck recoiled, clutching his arm, eyes wide behind his respirator. For a heartbeat, there was silence, the kind that holds its breath before choosing the shape of the world to come. Then another strike followed. This time from our side. A wrench swung downward, meeting a skull with a sound like wet stone. The victim crumpled without a cry. That was when screaming began. Violence in the Hive was not new. Fights over ration tokens, over hab spots, over air filters. It was common, ritualized almost. Quick, contained, punished. But this was different. There was no overseer to bark commands, no Arbite's shock mauls to impose discipline, no machine spirit alarms to signal trespass, no law. Only need. The platform became a churning mass of bodies colliding in panic and fury. Pipes clanged against railings, chains whistled through the air, people grappled and clawed, stumbling dangerously close to the transit rail's edge, where a fall meant vanishing into the abyss below. The air filled with a sound of metal on bone, bone on metal, the ragged tearing of breath, the guttural noises of animal survival. There were no sides. It was not us against them. It was proximity, instinct, reflex. Bodies collided because they had nowhere else to go. I remember being thrown against a support pillar, the impact rattling my teeth. A figure loomed in front of me, a worker, gaunt, bleeding from the scalp, swinging a rusted blade. I did not think. My hand closed around the torch clipped to my belt and I ignited it. The blue flame roared to life with a sharp hiss. His eyes widened, not with fear but with recognition. The flame meant heat. Heat meant pain. Pain meant something that was still real. He hesitated. I did not. I drove the torch forward. The flame kissed fabric first, then skin. He screamed, a raw sound that cut through the chaos, and fell back. The smell of burning flesh rolled through the air, thick and nauseating, clinging to the rebreather filters like rot. Around me, the platform was a blur of motion. Sparks flew where tools clashed. Blood smeared across metal. A child cried but could not be found in the crush. Someone fell over the edge. No scream, just silence that swallowed them whole. And through all of it, the hive continued to pulse. The vent veins along the walls brightened, glowing with a deeper intensity, as though excitement stirred within the metal itself. The heat rose further, the air thinned, breathing became harder, panic deepened, then the lights went out again. Not slowly this time, all at once. Darkness hit like a hammer. People froze, not by choice, but because the body does not know how to move without sight when every movement could be death. The sounds continued, whimpers, sobs, dragging footsteps, the quiet shift of bodies searching for space, and then a sound rose beneath us, not from throats, from the hive itself, a deep, rhythmic thrum, dumb, dumb, dumb. Not mechanical, not hydraulic, a heartbeat, slow, steady, alive. The scrape of metal against metal followed, the same sound we had heard in the stairwell, the sound of something climbing. Someone whispered in the dark, "They're here," and the fighting stopped. Not because peace had returned, but because every head turned toward the sound of what was approaching from below. Shapes began to emerge, silhouettes crawling over the railings and up the walls, bodies moving with liquid, unnatural ease, masked faces, empty eyes, glowing slits of bioluminescent light. Those who had descended into the fire, those who had been remade, they did not charge, they simply moved forward, and the crowd parted, not in fear, but in surrender. The violence, the blood, the desperation, it all ceased, replaced by something worse, resignation. The city did not need to kill us. We were already yielding. The masked figures passed through us like water through stone, and we became the riverbed. The hive's heartbeat quickened. We were not fighting for survival anymore. We were fighting for identity, and we were losing. The masked figures moved through us with the slow certainty of a tide returning to shore. No urgency, no threat displayed. Their bodies bore burns, scar tissue, welding seams where flesh and metal had mingled, but they showed no pain. They were not triumphant, they were not enraged, they were simply changed. We watched them pass, and some among us stepped back instinctively, pressing against support pillars and rail housings, trying to make themselves smaller. But others, too many, did the opposite. Their breathing slowed, their posture softened, their eyes unfocused, and they moved toward the mass procession with a quiet inevitability that felt like sleepwalking. The remade did not touch them, they simply reached out a hand, palm up, fingers open, invitation, not command, and those who accepted reached back. Skin met metal, and the instant it happened, the person's breath changed. Slow, heavy inhalations, lungs adjusting to a rhythm that was not their own. Their eyes dimmed, not with death, with surrender, like a candle flame smothered by a glass jar. They joined the procession, step for step, no hesitation, no resistance, no identity. There is a horror greater than violence. Violence is loud, it has shape, direction, but this was something else. A quiet unmaking, a dissolution of will, a soft erasure. We always imagined the end of a hive would be fire and screaming and steel. We never imagined it would look like calm. Someone next to me whispered, voice trembling, "Are they alive?" Alive, yes, but not themselves. The procession reached the far end of the platform where a heavy industrial elevator shaft rose upward into darkness. The platform indicator screens, long broken, flickered for a moment, stuttering symbols, blank segments, half-burned numerals. Then, without any of us touching it, the elevator shuddered to life. It rose, not down toward the fire, up toward the mid-habs, toward the spire, toward the places where the nobles lived behind gilded armor glass and filtered atmosphere, pretending they were untouched by the world beneath. Something below had chosen to move upward. The remade boarded the lift, so did the newly surrendered. The doors slid shut with a soft pneumatic sigh. There was no floor indicator, no destination, just that slow, patient ascent. For a long time, none of us spoke. We stood in the aftershock of silence, surrounded by the wounded and the dazed, the half-conscious and the shaking. The platform felt enormous now, an empty cathedral of steel and sorrow. Blood pooled near a broken railing. The air smelled of rust, smoke, and sweat, human and mechanical, inseparable. Someone, perhaps the same woman who first said to go up, finally spoke again. Her voice was different now, not resolute, not certain, but hollow, like something inside her had cracked. If we stay here, we will join them. Not because we wanted to, because the hive wanted us to. The rails hummed with the echo of the rising lift. The hive's heartbeat thudded beneath our feet. I looked at the people around me and saw a truth none of us wanted. Survival was no longer about strength, it was about memory. What we remembered of ourselves, what we refused to give, but memory is a fragile thing in a place that is rewriting the rules of identity itself. We gathered what we could: torches, fractured pipes, lengths of cable, water canisters already half evaporated from heat. Tools, not weapons, but tools can become weapons when gripped hard enough. We moved once more, upward, through access tunnels warped by heat expansion, through ventilation walkways where the glow pulsing in the ducts grew brighter, pulsing now like arteries, through old transit terminals decorated with propaganda murals of the Emperor's gaze, now flaking and peeling, revealing older symbols beneath, symbols that looked disturbingly like the masks. The hive was revealing layers we had never known existed, layers it had hidden, and as we climbed, the architecture itself began to change. Walls curved in unfamiliar directions, hallways spiraled slightly, subtly wrong, as if space itself was warping. The hive was not just collapsing or burning or starving, it was reorganizing, reclaiming, reforming. We reached a checkpoint gate, huge, armored, the kind Arbites used to maintain controlled flow between labor levels. The lock had been melted, metal dripping like wax, not cut, not forced, melted from the inside. Beyond it lay a corridor that should not have existed, a space too wide, too open, too vast, a place where the hive's internal logic should have prevented emptiness. We crossed the threshold and saw what waited inside, not fire, not death, not remade, something far worse, something the hive had been hiding, something that explained everything. The chamber beyond the melted gate should not have existed within a hive. The architecture of these cities is dense, layered, modular, walls against corridors, against reinforcement beams packed so tightly that even empty space has weight. But this place was open, vast, a hollow carved into the hive's heart like a lung emptied of breath. The ceiling arched high above us, vanishing into shadow. The floor stretched outward in concentric platforms of metal and cracked ferrocrete, each layer sinking lower and lower toward a central pit. The air was warmer here, humid even. My mask filters clogged instantly, struggling against particles I could not name. I tasted rust and brine and something like old blood. Light radiated from the walls, not lumen strips, not torch fire, a soft pulsing luminescence that throbbed in slow intervals, as though the chamber itself possessed a heartbeat. We descended the first ring without speaking. The sound of our footsteps echoed strangely, muted in some places, amplified in others. The architecture felt wrong, curved in ways human hands would not shape, lines that guided the eye downward whether one wanted to look or not. At the center of the pit lay something vast, not a machine, not a statue, a structure, a mass, a shape of metal fused with something that was not metal. Pipes ran into it like veins, wires snaked along its surface like sinew, plates of worn ceramite protruded like overlapping scales, and beneath it all, I could see the old bones of the hive, ancient struts, foundation supports, cathedral buttressing, repurposed, reshaped, rewritten. It was not alive, but it was not dead either. It pulsed, slowly, patiently, as though dreaming. We stood in a ring around it, unable to look away. Someone whispered, voice cracking, "Is it a reactor?" Another answered, barely audible, "Reactor cores don't breathe." A third voice, quiet as dust settling, said what none of us wanted spoken. "Maybe it's always been here." The hive was built layer upon layer, century upon century, world upon world. Foundations forgotten, histories buried, entire civilizations paved over in the Imperium's relentless need for production. No one alive could say what the first builders of the hive had worshipped, feared, or bound beneath the stone. We were not looking at a beginning, we were looking at a return. The structure shifted, slowly, a ripple passing across its surface like muscle flexing beneath skin. We stepped back as one. A vent shaft above us exhaled, releasing a warm gust of air that washed across the chamber. The temperature rose further, the pulsing light intensified, and then, softly, terribly, sound emerged. Not speech, not chant. Breathing. Slow, deep, resonant. The same rhythm the masked procession had moved with. The rhythm the remade had inhaled by instinct. The rhythm the hive had been teaching us this entire time. Someone behind me fell to their knees, not from worship, but because the body collapses before the mind can refuse. Their breath caught, their mask fogged, their shoulders trembled. Another followed, then another. Dozens, hundreds, not praying, just kneeling, as if their legs no longer remembered how to stand. I felt myself sway, my knees softening, my balance shifting towards surrender. The air was thick, heavy, rich with pressure that pushed downward. It would have been so easy to let go, to allow the hive to decide, to become part of something instead of resisting alone. But I remembered the platform, the fight, the torch in my hand, the scream of a man who still wanted to live. The weight of choice. Memory is the only weapon identity has. I forced my breath to quicken, shallow, unnatural, painful, disrupting the rhythm, refusing to match it. Not many did the same. Most did not even realize they were surrendering. We backed away, those of us who still could. Slow steps, careful steps. Eyes locked to the shape in the pit as though turning away would allow it to rise. When we reached the threshold, I felt something shift in the air behind us, a ripple of awareness. Not malice, not hunger, recognition. The Hive knew we had seen it. It did not need to chase, it only needed to wait. We fled up the corridor, lungs burning, hearts pounding out of sync with the deeper pulse beneath our feet. Somewhere above us, alarms began to ring. Not broken ones, real ones, military grade, the kind that mean only one thing. The Astra Militarum had arrived, not to save us, to contain us, and whatever the Hive was becoming. The alarms rolled through the Hive like thunder. Real alarms, not the broken sputter of dying circuit relays. Sirens with clarity, authority, purpose. Their cry trembled through every wall and bulkhead, shaking loose dust that had settled for decades. It was the first sound in all these cycles that did not feel sick or failing. It felt decisive, final. The Astra Militarum had come. We knew the stories, every worker did. When the guard deploys inside a Hive, it is not a rescue. It is a culling. The Hive's population is never meant to be protected, only contained, managed, reduced if necessary. A Hive world is a resource. If the resource becomes tainted, it is not purified. It is burned. We ran. Not upward now. Sideways, across maintenance walkways and abandoned transit corridors, following currents of panic rather than reason. The others who fled with us were hollow-eyed, shaking, blood-stained, but alive. Too alive. Desperation sharpened the air. We emerged into a supply causeway overlooking one of the mid-level districts, a massive cavity of architecture suspended over a yawning industrial void. Catwalks, cargo cranes, hab spires rising like jagged teeth. And there, cutting across the open air on suspended transit rails, came the first guard transports. Chimeras modified for vertical traversal, hull plates scorched from orbit insertion, headlights cutting white spears through the haze. Their tracks screamed against steel rails as they braked, deploying squads in flak armor and rebreather masks. Laser guns at the ready, voxcasters hissing coded transmissions, and at their lead, the unmistakable black armor and scale-wrought cloaks of the Adeptus Arbites Judge Command. They had not been gone, they had been waiting. The judge's vox-amplified voice echoed across the causeway. By decree of the Lex Imperialis and the authority vested in the Office of Planetary Compliance, this district is under immediate quarantine. All civilians are to present themselves for inspection and classification. Non-compliance will be met with lethal force. His tone did not carry hatred or anger. It was simply the sound of inevitability. The guard fanned outward, disciplined, efficient. They moved in formation that swallowed corridors whole. In any other moment, we might have run to them, begged for shelter, pleaded for evacuation, but we had seen what lay below. We had seen what the Hive was becoming. We knew. Anyone who submitted would not be saved. They would be erased. Those who had knelt to the burning shafts had not fallen to madness. They had chosen, and the guard had arrived to make sure that choice did not spread. We did not move. We did not breathe. We were pinned between two dissolving worlds, the Hive transforming below, the Imperium crushing downward from above. There was no future in either direction. Someone beside me whispered, "There is no emperor here." It was not blasphemy, it was grief. One of the guardsmen noticed movement. He turned, lifted his rifle, and the laser sight traced across the railing toward us. A single slip of the foot, a shift in weight, a breath too loud, and then the Hive itself intervened. The vent veins along the walls brightened in a sudden surge, brilliant white gold light pulsing in a single synchronized wave through metal conduits, lighting ducts, pressure valves. The air trembled, the metal beneath our feet vibrated, and a deep, resonant pulse rolled outward from the foundations. A heartbeat, a living one. The guardsman froze. The judge's vox mask flickered. The Hive released a sound, not a roar, not a scream, but something low, layered and ancient. A sound that was not meant for ears, a sound meant for blood, for marrow, for memory. The remade had not been drawn by madness. They had been drawn by this. The guardsmen raised their weapons, and the Hive answered. From the lower catwalks, the massed procession surged upward, silent, fluid, unstoppable. They climbed beams, pipelines, crane cables, ascending like a tide that did not need bridges or roads. Their movements were coordinated, graceful, as though guided by a single intelligence distributed among countless bodies. The guard opened fire. Red last bolts lit the catwalks in staccato bursts, slicing glowing paths through smoke and steam. Figures fell, mask and flesh and metal alike, but more climbed, always more. Their formation did not break. They did not scream when shot. They simply adapted, flowed around casualties, ascended. The Hive was no longer a city of industry. It was a body, and it was waking up. We stood between armored order and transcendent surrender, our world collapsing into two futures we could not survive. And then, The platform beneath us shuddered. Something was rising from below, massive, measured, alive. The tremor began as a vibration through the metal, subtle at first, like the echo of distant machinery cycling up. But we knew the manufactorums were dead. The forges had gone cold. This was something else. The catwalks rattled. Dust shook loose from overhead beams. Bolts quivered in their sockets. The air pressure shifted, heavy enough to make our ears pop inside our masks. Something vast was moving beneath us. The guardsmen on the transit rail platform steadied themselves. The Arbit's judge lifted a signal baton, giving silent command. Their formation adjusted instantly, shifting angles of fire, creating interlocking lines of suppression. They were trained for war in corridors, on decks of starships, in trench lines under bombardment. Discipline was their anchor. The Hive could roar, burn, scream, but they would not break, unless the thing rising was something discipline could not touch. The massed procession climbed, dozens, hundreds. Their movements had become faster now, as though they sensed what approached. They flowed across beams and girders like veins forming across living tissue. The guards opened fire again. Last bolts cut through bodies, burning holes through metal masks and skin beneath. Some fell, many did not. But even they hesitated as the tremor deepened. A deep groan rolled through the steel, the sound of something ancient shifting. Not mechanical, not hydraulic, structural. The Hive itself was moving. For a moment everything held still. The guard, the mast, the workers trapped between them, listening, waiting. Then the floor cracked, not a small fracture, a rupture. A seam running across the platform split open, metal shearing with a shriek that drowned out the sirens. The catwalk lurched. People fell, some tumbled screaming off the edge into the abyss below. The guards staggered but did not break formation. They rerouted, rebalanced, their boots mag-clamping to the rails. The masked figures simply clung to the walls like insects. And then we saw it. Rising from the depths of the Hive through a lift shaft wide enough to swallow tanks came a shape. Not monstrous, not grotesque. Human-shaped, human-proportioned, but scaled to a size no unaugmented body should ever reach. A silhouette of plates and woven sinew, cables trailing from its limbs like umbilicals, each movement slow, deliberate. A titan, someone might have whispered once, but titans walk with thunder and engines, not silence. This thing moved without mechanical noise. It did not rumble, it did not grind, it ascended. The light from the glowing vent veins bathed its surface, revealing its nature. Not machine, not flesh, both. It was as if the Hive's chambers had sculpted themselves into the memory of a human form, as if the city had decided to stand up. The guardsman froze, not in fear, but in calculation. The judge spoke into his vox bead, voice sharp. Command, clarify, is this asset registered? Repeat, classify emergent structure Sinai level unknown. Request immediate mechanicus identification. No response. The Vox hissed static. The Hive had severed communication. The masked figures dropped to their knees in perfect unison. Not worship, recognition. They were kneeling to something they already understood. The guards' formation shifted to fire on the emerging figure, but the judge raised a hand and halted them. He was no fool. If this thing reacted to attack, none of us would live. We stood in the metal half-light between two impossibilities. The judge's amplified voice cut through the silence. To those still retaining autonomous thought, fall back. Regroup, ascend to upper levels. Now. Not an order of mercy, a tactical withdrawal, because even the Arbites had seen enough to know whatever the Hive was becoming, it was beyond reclaiming by force. We moved, not in panic this time, but in grim, exhausted obedience to survival. The guards formed a corridor, herding us upward. Rifles held ready, not against the masked figures now, but against us, because if we faltered, if we hesitated, if we began to change, they would not hesitate. Behind us, the masked figures raised their heads. Their masks glowed brighter. The Hive pulsed. The monolithic shape rose higher, revealing more of its towering form. Arms constructed of supporting trusses, spine formed from freight elevator scaffolding, muscle made of bundled cabling, ribcage fused from the frames of forgotten shrines. Not a creature, a memory of humanity, made from the city that had eaten humanity to sustain itself. The Hive was no longer a structure, it was a body, and it was waking. We climbed, not toward safety, but toward the final shape of the collapse, the spire, where those who had believed themselves above all this would soon learn that nothing in a Hive is ever truly above. We climbed toward the spire, though none of us had ever been meant to tread those levels. The Hive narrowed as we ascended. Corridors that once seemed vast now felt constricted, choked, as though the city itself was closing its grip behind us. The guards maintained formation around our group, every motion practiced, methodical. They were shepherds in a place where the flock had begun to grow fangs. The air was cooler here, not clean, but filtered, processed through purifiers that still functioned. It should have felt like relief. Instead, it felt thin. Artificial, like breathing memory instead of air. The glow of the veined luminescence in the ducts had softened, dimming to a faint pulse. The hive below had not stopped living, it had simply withdrawn its attention from us. The Arbite's judge walked ahead, robes brushing the floor in dark ripples. His armor, black and unadorned, absorbed the light rather than reflecting it. Only the aquila stamped into his chestplate shimmered faintly, worn down by years of handling. There was no zealotry in his pace, only duty. We passed through habitation tiers meant for mid-level administrators. The furniture was untouched, the floors were dustless, the halls were too quiet. It was as if the occupants had simply stepped away, mid-breath, mid-thought, mid-sentence, and had not come back. Someone whispered, "Where are they?" The guard nearest us did not look over, he only answered, flat behind his rebreather, "Evacuated up spire or processed below, do not dwell on it." Processed. The word hung in the air like chemical residue. It said everything without naming anything. We walked past a viewing port, one of the few places in the hive where glass met open space. The spire rose above us, a column of steel-framed cathedrals and nobles' palaces wrapped in armored plating and gilded ornamentation, glittering even under failing lumens. It looked like salvation, it looked like a promise, but the smoke rising from below licked at its foundations. The hive was climbing toward them. Of course it was. They had always lived off the labor below. Now the below simply came to reclaim its due. The judge activated a security arch, and the doors sealed behind us. It was the first intact bulkhead we had seen in cycles. The guard took positions flanking the corridor, rifles angled downward, posture controlled, but I could sense tension through their armor, in the way their fingers hovered near triggers, in the brittle stillness of their stance. They weren't afraid of the hive below anymore. They were afraid of us, not because of what we had done, because of what the hive had shown us. The judge turned to face us. His vox grill crackled as it modulated his voice, flattening all humanity from it. "You have seen that which was not meant to be uncovered. The lower hive has entered a state of irretrievable deviation. We will not speak of it nor recognize it. The Imperium does not negotiate with corruption." Corruption? That was the word they always used when they could not comprehend. But what we saw below had not been corruption, it had been memory. The judge's hand hovered over a rune pad. A door slid open. Inside was a hall of banners, great tapestries depicting the hive's founding, the triumphs of its governorship, the wealth it had funneled to the Imperium in tithes and regiments and manufactured war engines. The banners hung limp, untouched by airflow. Silent. A woman stood at the far end of the hall. Her gown was made of layered synth silk patterned with gold thread and the sigil of the planetary house. Her hair was coiled in ceremonial braids. Her jewelry glowed faintly in the lumen strip's failing light. Her posture was perfect, but her eyes were hollow. No fire, no will, no terror. Only quiet, exhausted understanding. She was a governor, perhaps not the highest, but high enough that the air around her felt curated, considered. She looked at the judge, then at us. "The spire is not safe," she said. Her voice was calm, steady, resigned. "The transformation is already here." The judge did not lower his weapon. "State the vector of contamination." The governor's lips trembled, not with fear, but with humorless grief. "It wasn't the lower levels that changed first," she said. "It was the communications vault, the power cathedral, the water reliquary, everything connected to the core. It is not spreading from below." She looked past us toward the vent veins alive with slow light. "It is rising from the heart." Silence hardened like cooling steel. The hive had not been consumed from the bottom, it had awakened from the center. The guard's formation shifted, subtly, instinctively, into withdrawal posture. The judge whispered the one word no hive ever wants to hear. Exterminatus protocol is being considered. We all knew what that meant. The hive was now a choice, burn with it, or change with it. The moment the judge spoke that word, something in the air seemed to thin. Not physically, our lungs still rasped against the filters, but spiritually, as if the world itself recoiled. Exterminatus, the sanctioned end of a world. The acknowledgement that a place, a people, a history had ceased to be salvageable. That the Emperor's light no longer required their continuation. We felt it in our bones. The hive had been our planet, our sky, our only home, and now those sworn to defend it were preparing to erase it without hesitation. The governor did not argue. That was the most terrifying part. She simply exhaled, a slow release of breath, as though she had been carrying that inevitability for far longer than we had. "You believe you can destroy what is happening," she said quietly. "But you are already inside it. We all are." The judge did not react. but his hand tightened slightly on the haft of his shock maul, a motion so subtle it bordered on involuntary. The guard around us shifted, reorienting toward exits, choke points, fallback positions. They were preparing not for negotiation, but for retreat, extraction. They had already accepted that sealing the hive behind them might be the only solution. The governor gestured toward a corridor leading further up Spire. The evacuation shafts are sealed. The upper district transport wings were the first to fall silent, not from assault, from alignment. She paused, struggling for the right word. It was as if the hive simply ceased to recognize them. Like a body retracting blood from a limb it no longer needed. We all understood. The judge turned to us. Civilians are to remain here. You will be held until decontamination assessment is complete. It was not a lie. It was a sentence. One of the workers behind me, someone who had fought on the platform, who still smelled of burnt flesh and fear, stepped forward. We aren't infected, he said. We're still ourselves. The judge's visor rotated a fraction toward him. If you were not compromised, you would not have followed us here. There it was, the seal on our fate. The governor's expression softened. Not pity, not sympathy, something quieter. Recognition between prisoners. You must understand, she said. The hive isn't being taken. It is reverting. The word hung heavy. Reverting to what? A memory of itself, a memory older than the Imperium, a memory older than record. The judge raised his maul, not to strike, but to signal. The guards aimed their rifles, and then the hive answered. The lights flickered, not dim, not stuttering, not failing, synchronizing. The glow from the vent veins brightened to brilliance, not firelight, not lumens, something deeper, purposed. The floor trembled, not shaking, breathing, the same pulse we had heard in the depths, the same rhythm the remade inhaled, the same cadence in the flames of the shaft, a slow, resonant, living heartbeat. The governor's voice broke to a whisper. It has reached the spire. The walls themselves began to change. Patterns surfaced beneath paint and plating, not carved, not painted, grown. Symbols shaped from intertwined metal grains like circuitry designed by organic thought. Spirals, branches, anatomical diagrams of structures that did not belong to any species we knew. The guards opened fire, not at us, but at the walls. The metal rippled, absorbing the heat scarring of last fire like muscle tensing under impact. Not defense, acknowledgement. A voice rose from below, not human, not mechanical, a single sustained note layered from a million throats that had forgotten individuality, a chant without words, a hymn without worship. The remade were coming, not marching, ascending. The judge barked an evacuation order. The guards began to pull back, not running, but moving with the efficient desperation of soldiers who know they are already too late. The governor did not move. She watched the wall as the spirals pulsed with light, and for the first time since the collapse began, she smiled, not with joy, with inevitability. I think, she whispered, we were never meant to survive this. We were only meant to remember it. The floor beneath us lurched. The hive had begun its final movement, not falling, rising toward a shape we could not yet see, but would soon be inside. The hive did not collapse all at once. There was no single moment where walls fell and the world ended in flame. Instead, the change unfolded the way night replaces day, gradual at first, invisible until you look back and realize the light is gone and the dark has been there for some time. We climbed because there was nowhere else left to go. The guards led the way, forming a corridor of rifles and armor, not to protect us from the hive, but to keep us from becoming part of it. The governor walked among us without fear, her steps slow, unhurried, like someone walking through remembered halls. She was not resigned, she was returning. The corridors narrowed the higher we went. The walls were no longer made of industrial plating or habstone reinforcement. They were smooth, seamless, flowing into one another like molded clay. The angles of the hive had softened. Corners had become curves, hallways looped in gentle arcs. It felt less like walking through architecture, and more like traveling through the veins of an organism that had rediscovered its pulse. The guard were silent now. They did not speak into their vox links. They did not issue orders. Their weapons were held ready, but their eyes behind their visors flickered with something I did not expect. Awe. Even they knew they were walking in a place that was no longer theirs. The governor paused at a wide corridor junction where a viewing arch overlooked the lower hive. We stopped beside her. Below, the hive glowed. The vent veins pulsed in vast networks, lighting entire districts in warm golden radiance. The manufactorum stacks, once black with smoke, now rose like pillars of bone. The hab blocks, once cramped and hard-edged, curved into sweeping terraces of interwoven scaffolding. The industrial refineries flowed like rivers of metal joining into a single core. The city was no longer a city, it was a body, not human, not machine. something between, something remembering what it had once been before the Imperium had shaped it into a tool. The judge did not look at the view. His voice rasped through his vox grill, low and hard. The planetary signal relay must be destroyed. If exterminatus is issued and the fleet above confirms corruption, the entire planet will burn. The governor nodded, but not in agreement. Yes, she said, that is what they will do. Her tone carried no accusation, only inevitability. They will not stop, the judge continued. They cannot. No, she said softly. They cannot, because they do not understand what this is. One of the guards finally spoke, quiet, almost hesitant. What is it? The governor turned her head slightly, not to look at him, but to look past him, toward the pulsing hive below. A memory, she said. Older than us. Older than the Imperium, perhaps older than mankind's first steps among the stars, something the hive was built over, not into. We forgot it, but it did not forget us. The judge stepped closer, his shockmaul humming faintly. You speak as though you welcome it. She did not flinch. I no longer fear being small. The guards shifted, a quiet statement, but no soldier can hear surrender without bracing for collapse. Something moved far below, slow, massive, deliberate. The towering shape we had seen rising in the industrial depths was climbing still, its silhouette now visible among the refineries. It carried no weapon, it burned nothing, it simply ascended, not to conquer, to become whole. We continued upward. The passageways narrowed further, curving and pulsing gently with the rhythm of the hive's breath. The light grew dimmer, not failing, but softening, becoming internal. Voices drifted from somewhere unseen, not whispers, not chants, breathing, synchronized, calm. The remade were near. We reached the signal relay altar, not a cathedral as we had imagined, but a simple room built around a spire of crystal relay arrays. The machine hummed softly, untouched, a relic of order. The judge stepped toward it, ready to issue the command that would silence the hive's broadcast to the fleet above. Then he stopped, because someone was already there. Belle! The woman who worked beside us in the manufactoria, who had spoken of the hive forgetting how to breathe, who had disappeared into the flames. She turned toward us. Her eyes were not empty. They were clearer than they had ever been. She spoke one sentence. If you sever the signal, the hive will die. And behind her, the city exhaled. Belle stepped forward from the relay altar, and the room seemed to reshape around her presence. Not physically, but in the way the mind reorients itself toward a focal point. Her posture was relaxed, unarmed, unguarded, but there was no softness in her expression, no plea, only clarity, sharpened like glass in a furnace. The judge raised his shockmaul slightly, enough to signal lethal intent. The guards sighted their rifles. Belle did not react. She did not even blink. She spoke in a voice we recognized, but steadier, grounded in something deeper than certainty. You think the hive is dying, she said. But it was dying before, dying for centuries. We just lived inside its corpse and called it home. She looked to the governor, and the governor nodded, not in surrender but in understanding, as though she had been waiting for someone else to speak the words she could not yet admit aloud. The judge's voice grated through the vox. Step away from the relay. You are compromised. Belle smiled. Not mockery, not warmth. Recognition. Compromised is a word for those who fear becoming what they already are. The guards tensed. They would fire if commanded. Their discipline was unbreakable, but even now I saw the question in their stance. Not doubt, conflict. They had been taught to know the enemy by shape, by sound, by action. But what do you do when the enemy is a memory waking inside your own bones? Belle placed her palm on the relay crystal. The light pulsed, not mechanically but organically, a slow bloom of warmth that radiated outward. The guard nearest her flinched, stepping back as though heat had passed through his armor. The judge barked a code syllable into his vox, but the channel returned only static. The hive was controlling the signal pathways. Belle did not raise her voice, yet the chamber carried each word with perfect clarity. The hive was built over something ancient. A skeleton of a city that was never meant to be industrial, never meant to be a machine. It was a temple, a cradle, a body. Over time, we carved into it, poured steel into bones, scraped memory clean so we could make it produce, manufacture, sustain the endless hunger of war. Her gaze traveled across us, not accusing, not pitying. But a body remembers itself, even when buried under centuries of purpose, not its own. The judge moved forward, maul raised to strike. The governor stepped between them, not to protect Belle, to protect the judge. Look behind you, she said. He hesitated, only a fraction of a second, but it was enough. We turned. The remade had arrived. They stood in the doorway, neither advancing nor retreating. Their masks no longer looked like scrap. Their limbs no longer looked starved. Their movements no longer twitched with the hesitant grace of bodies relearning purpose. They were whole now, unified in posture, expressionless, breathing in perfect rhythm, a single organism wearing many shapes. But when they inhaled, Bell inhaled, and so did the Hive. The judge saw it. Not metaphor, not faith, systemic coherence. He lowered his maul, not in surrender, in comprehension. Bell spoke again, softly now, like a teacher reminding a child of something they once knew but forgot. The Hive is not rising to consume us. It is rising because we are part of it. We always were. The collapse was not the end, it was the chrysalis. The room trembled, a gentle movement, like lungs drawing breath. The guards exchanged glances, not fear now, not revulsion, recognition. The governor drew a slow, steady breath and removed her rebreather mask. The judge reached for her, a hand raised in protest, but she only shook her head. I am tired of breathing air that does not belong to me. The air should have been toxic. It was not. It was warm, clean, real. I realized then that the air below had not been poison, it had been transformation, and we had mistaken it for death. Bell stepped away from the relay. The fleet above is listening. They are waiting for a justification, a trigger, a confirmation of corruption. Her eyes softened. But if the signal continues, if the Hive speaks for itself, they will hesitate, because they will not understand. The governor looked to the judge, not asking permission, offering a choice. His jaw clenched, his hand trembled. He had been shaped by law, by duty, by the certainty of order, but here, law had no meaning. Duty had no object. Order had no anchor. He lowered his weapon. The guards followed. Bell turned back to the relay. The Hive drew breath, and we breathed with it. The relay spire thrummed beneath Bell's hand, the frequency low enough to be felt rather than heard. It vibrated up through the floor, into our boots, into marrow. The Hive, vast and incomprehensible, was listening through her, through all of us, not as master to subjects, not as predator to prey, as something waking that had never been dead, only dormant. The judge stood motionless. His posture was no longer rigid with command, but still, as though suspended between two gravitational pulls. Behind him, the guards lowered their rifles without being ordered to, not in surrender, in recognition. They had signed on to face demons, heretics, Xenos horrors, but this was none of those. This was home remembering itself. Bell's voice was not triumphant, it was quiet, human, fragile in its honesty. We were never meant to be fuel, she said, never meant to be consumed until we were empty. The Hive was not built to drain us. We built the drain. We forgot the shape beneath it. The governor looked at her, really looked at her, as though for the first time she was seeing something familiar rather than foreign. You knew, she said, even below, even before. Bell nodded once. I heard the breath of the Hive long before I understood what it was. I thought it was madness. I thought I was breaking. But madness does not bring understanding. Madness isolates. This... She gestured around us to the glowing vents and softly pulsing walls, the remade standing in quiet, unified attention. This is connection. The judge forced out a breath, filtered, labored. Connection is not justification, a structure that consumes identity, whatever its purpose. Bell met his gaze without fear. Identity was never singular. You only believed it had to be. He opened his mouth to argue, then the relay flared. A wave of golden light moved through it, gentle, warm, like sunrise through stained glass. The energy did not burn. It wrapped around us, through us, into us. I felt the shape of my own breath match the Hive's pulse for a heartbeat too long. I felt the weight of myself soften at the edges like frost melting from a window pane. I pulled back with effort. Memory is the last refuge of the self. Bell watched me, not disappointed, not demanding, simply acknowledging that choice was still possible. The fleet is waiting for confirmation, she said. If the Hive speaks now, they will not fire. The judge's voice was a whisper. And if they do fire regardless... Bell lowered her hand from the relay. Then you will belong to something larger than their fire can erase. She did not speak those words aloud. She didn't have to. The governor looked out the viewing arch again, down at the golden-lit architecture unfolding below, a city reborn not through destruction but recollection. A cathedral of memory the size of continents. Her shoulders lowered, a tension decades old released. If we allow the signal to continue, she said, we are choosing transformation. If we sever it, the judge answered, we are choosing death. Silence. No one commanded, no one instructed, no one begged. because the decision was no longer about control. It was about what it meant to remain human in the presence of something that had once shaped us and now remembered how to again. The remade stepped forward, slowly, gently. They did not reach for us, they did not drag us into the hive's breath, they simply stood close enough that we could feel their presence. They were not empty. I had been wrong. Their eyes shone with a depth I had never seen in any worker, any noble, any soldier. They had not lost themselves. They had expanded. The judge looked at Bell, at the governor, at us, and then he deactivated his maul. The sound was small, barely audible, but it was the sound of a world choosing to live, even if the shape of living would no longer be the same. And then, the hive spoke, not in words, in breath, one long inhalation, and the relay transmitted it to the sky, to the ships above, to the Imperium, to whatever waited to judge us. The breath that rose through the relay was not sound, not signal, not language. It was the sensation of a memory re-entering the world. A warmth, a pressure, a presence. Something that should have been impossible for machinery to transmit. And yet, the relay pulsed with it. Soft bands of golden light flowing upward through crystal filaments into vox arrays into the sky. Far above us, beyond steel vaulting and kilometers of hive architecture, past the ash clouds and the broken weather towers, the message crossed into orbit. We could not hear the fleet's response, but we felt the hesitation. A stillness spread through the hive, the kind that settles before a bullet lands, before a verdict is spoken, before a world chooses its shape. A quiet so vast that we could hear our own heartbeats fragile against the pulse of the city. No orbital bombardment, no atmospheric cracking, no ignition of world-burning torpedoes, just silence. The Imperium was listening. The judge closed his eyes. He had expected the final act of his duty to be swift, clean, unquestioned. But duty without context is only violence wearing law as a mask. He stood now in the space between law and truth, and he knew the Emperor did not speak where certainty ends. Bell turned to us, not to persuade, not to instruct, but to invite. "The hive remembers us," she said. "We can choose to remember it in return." The remade moved closer, but they did not touch us. Their breathing was calm, measured, whole. One of the guards removed his helmet, slowly, carefully. His face was gaunt, pale, drawn from exhaustion and too many battles fought under banners that no longer could explain themselves. He inhaled the hive's air directly. He did not fall. He did not change. He simply exhaled with something like relief. The rest followed, not all, but many. Rebreathers unclasped and fell to the floor in a scatter of metal and straps. The air that filled our lungs was warm, not choking, not chemical, not poisonous. It tasted of iron and dust, and something faintly sweet like pollen from flowers none of us had ever seen. Memory, that was the taste. I removed my mask. The world did not shift in a blaze of revelation. No voices rang through my skull, no visions swallowed me. There was only breath, simple and undeniable. My lungs expanded. The air filled them cleanly without effort. My pulse slowed, matching, without losing itself, the hive's rhythm. Myself did not dissolve. It grew. Bell watched us with eyes that did not shine with divinity or victory, only relief. "You see," she whispered, "nothing was taken from us, only returned." The governor bowed her head, not in surrender, but in acceptance. The judge looked at his hands, scarred from decades of enforcement and punishment, and he exhaled with a quiet, shuddering breath. He did not remove his mask. Not yet, but his posture no longer held the rigidity of a man resisting the world. He had begun to listen. Far below, the colossal figure continued its ascent, slow, patient, inevitable. It reached the mid-hive platforms and paused, as though waiting for the hive's breath to finish rising. Its surface glowed faintly now, lit by the same pulse that traveled through duct veins and signal arrays. It did not look like a god, it looked like a memory of us. The hive did not want worship, it wanted reunion. Outside, the sirens stopped. The vents stilled. The heartbeat slowed to a calm, resting rhythm. No enemy, no war, just the end of forgetting. We were not absolved. We were not saved. We were not elevated to glory. The Imperium would not celebrate us. Other worlds would not hear our story. There would be no sermons, no litanies, no statues. We would simply live. Changed, connected, remembered. The judge finally spoke, voice no longer modulated, quiet and human behind his mask. "What happens now?" Belle did not smile. She did not need to. "Now," she said, "we become the hive we always were." And the city breathed, not as a machine, not as a tomb, but as a world waking from a long and troubled sleep. End.